Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Man at YouTube with another model video, 3D printing. Having a look at CG Trader, I purchased an XBF file of Yukari from Girls and Panzer, most likely created in some sort of Adobe suite. My intent is to download or purchase these models and using Blender, which you can edit the clothing and even rig and change the pose, create STL files to 3D print. It was a little bit tricky and I came across all sorts of challenges like all the clothing on at the same time and what is printable or not. Jumping on Google, I was able to find her height and feeding the information into Scale Model Calculator pumped out the size for a 1/7 model that I would be able to print on my Anycubic Mono X printer, which I've just recently set up and explored the ideal settings to get an excellent model out of it. Scaling occurred in Autodesk Mesh Mixer. As the model was a little too tall to print in one piece, I've sliced it around the waist at the skirt line for easy assembling to be pinned at a later point. At this point, I should have noticed when things were going to go horribly wrong, then exported the file in an appropriate STL file format. The second suite I moved the models to was Anycubic's slicing software. To have as minimal issues as possible, I had them vertical, put the supports in, and pumped out the model to be sliced and printed on the spot. With the printer containing resin and all the ideal specs put in perfectly operating order, and most importantly 60% power to not overexpose, nothing could have possibly gone wrong. Fortunately, I'm used to drafting in CAD and creating solid models which would later be turned into a mesh. When models are made from other sources and software, they may not necessarily be 3D printable, and this is where a lot of failed prints can occur. This was somewhat a coloured model with detail that was paper or wafer thin around the panty line, the bust and the eyes. This was not printable, but I've included them in the model when rendered into STL, and they created a very ugly solid line right across the details, face, body, making it completely unable to work with. If the first video is reviewing, setting up and debugging the Anycubic Mono X to be usable for your scale modeling or 3D printing hobby, this is going to be a supplemental model on working on the actual modeling part and software parts and dealing with an imperfect print, then processing it into a workable model. In this shot you can see the crazy lump of resin right in front of the legs and feet. Out of rage and disappointment, I did not retain the model. The issues occurred did not become apparent to me that I've edited and removed the wrong components of the model incorrectly, though looking at the slicing settings, I figured out by laying the model on its side I'll be able to remove the solid piece of resin and still make a fairly effective model without eliminating any vital detail. The Slice Preview is an amazing tool that I should utilize more often to see if there's going to be anything obstructing or in the way. I understand it's also possible to use other slicing software to get a different result, such as BitChute. Researching a bit on social media forums and discussion groups on 3D printing. My solution is to fix the source model and edit it better in Blender Studio and retesting it. However, I think it would be far more fun and productive if I learned 3D sculpting on ZBrush or something with very smooth lines. This will be a future endeavor. At a intermediate resolution, slow retraction and a few seconds of exposure with a longer wait time, horizontally this was a far quicker print with intermediate supports. You can also see that some parts around the sock line and the other points that I've noted have these very thick ungodly resin pieces that did disturb the model, and even slight cutaways at the resin, which again is absolutely workable, but due to being horizontal and these extra resin bits, the cleanup is going to be a fairly painful and tedious opposed to a very well printed model. Some parts where the resin was very, very thin through the model drafting around the skirts has completely collapsed and will require some filling with putty. Another issue with a model so big followed by a very big 3D printer, I don't have a suitable curing and wash up machine. Utilizing methylated spirits, I cleaned the model in a large pan and did the majority of the cleanup wearing gloves, as there is still some trapped resin. After all the supports has been trimmed using traditional model tools and removing the nubs with a knife, I was able to give a secondary wash and then place it outside in the driveway to naturally cure with the sun's UV. Again, the print was absolutely perfect, maybe slightly overexposed, but unfortunately the model did fail me in being far too experimental and testing far too many things with such a new printer. I was very intent in having a 1/7 Yukari in a winter uniform and continued to push forward. Through some experimental and clever repositioning in the slicing software, any crucial detail that would be too difficult for me to hand sculpt with putty was not an issue at all. All the supports have been removed and re-cleaned up, and the next stage will be repairing this model and cleaning up more nub marks. Ideally, when printing, you want to have as thin supports as possible for less of a cleanup, but as things get heavier and may bow or distort the model, you have to be a bit strategic. The really thick resin pieces that protruded around inappropriate parts were sawn off with a hobby saw. The solid resin did make it chip and fracture in various points. Another thing I didn't quite like about this model is blowing it up. I've noticed it's quite low poly. Either because this was utilized for video games, animation, or something, it might not have been intended to be looked at so up close. Getting some 120 grit sandpaper, which is normally far too coarse for plamo or scale modeling, leaving very deep engraved dents, I was able to round off all the surfaces and sharp edges into a natural curve. Going to more traditional garage resin kit techniques and tips, I drilled some holes where the two halves would connect and put metal steel pins to hold them in place after painting. Their position held fairly well. In the repair front, utilizing Milliput, a 2-part epoxy putty where you cut 2 equal parts of material and fuse together, will chemically set into a very hard substance that you're able to sand, engrave, or work with. It's not very brittle and will hold its place and stick to all sorts of formations. Tearing it into pieces, I'm able to stick it in the various holes and errors that have occurred and smoothed out the surface to be natural to the texture of clothing by wetting my finger and smoothing it out. There is still a bit of a texture left from the rough sculpt. After 24 hours, utilizing 120 grit sandpaper, I was able to buff it down flat to the same level and consistency as the resin. You can work your way up to finer grits of sandpaper to polish the surface. Level of effort is equal to a bad or vintage recast resin kit. With all of this sanding, cutting, trimming, little nub marks from supports, sculpting with putty, cracks and damage, we're surely not going to have a perfect surface by the least bit. Thinning down some automotive thinner putty that is utilized for cars, scratch work, dent and bodywork, thinned it with lacquer thinner and sprayed it through a 0.5mm needle nozzle airbrush and really blasted the paint on thickly in multiple wet coats to fill as many issues as humanly possible, but also to visually see where there are some major issues that need further work. This was all marked out with a permanent texture to remember where to apply further putty, sanding or trimming of supports. With the same filler putty, I've thickened it even further with baking soda to become an actual modeling putty, and with a fine Q-tip, applied it on all the little pock marks and weird areas. With automotive sandpaper in assortment from 120 all the way to 2000 grit, and 24 hours drying after all that putty and filler primer applied, was all sand down to its base resin finish. With a fascinating marbled finish, we're able to see how much work we've applied and materials removed to a more figure look finish. This is typical technique used on kit bashing, scratch building, and again older recast resin kits. As the filler primer does fill some panel lines in detail, any folds or panels are rescribed with a tungsten tip panel line scriber. From this marble state, I refilled my airbrush with the filler putty primer mix and put a second very heavy coat to look for further errors. It was then refilled with more putty, sanded back, and a final coat of putty to show that the figure is practically smoothed out and finished in cleanup and sanding. Here's a few stages of where it got rough and where things start to improve and less putting is required with every layer. I did this process 3 times. The 4th time was the final coat of primer. Now we're at the halfway point, painting all downhill, lots of masking. Ideally, if I drafted this model or had more control over the actual build, I'd slice it at all sorts of points: the flesh, the boots, the skirt, the dress, the head and hair differently, to paint them and assemble them after painting, just like a garage kit. Masking will be fairly painful, and ideally for the 3D printing community, getting that perfect model straight out of the printer, a lot of the work I've already invested and time would have been negated through an ideal 2-piece vertical print. Using the same workstation as I did for the primer filler, we'll be using hobby branded paints, all lacquers, thinned down by automotive brand of premium lacquer thinner that's a leveling thinner, more so known as Mr. Hobby leveling thinner. This is just a more budget version. Flesh can be a bit tricky to paint, especially with anime girls and all that, and being very lightly pigmented light colours, they can become quite drab or almost even dirty looking. So we started off with a very heavy pigment count Zurich white as a base coat, and with about 3 to 4 different shades of browns to anime flesh and blush, built it up with the airbrush via shading in a modular fashion of light and colour that would be natural to skin, doing a little bit of shading around the kneecaps and behind the knees. The pre-shading lines is not necessarily to achieve any shadowing effect, but to separate the model visually for shading in the freehand work. A clear was applied to the flesh, a few days allowed to dry, and mask applied via both masking tape trimmed on the self-healing mat and liquid latex mask used for RC cars. Very slow drying compared to the Mr. Soul by Mr. Hobby, but very thick and easy to peel off. For the next layer of components, I wanted to cut back a bit of time, so base coating was done by brush painting. The white skirt had a silver finish hand painted, which I could lighten up with light and then grey, and then a very stark white shadowed right on the tips. The hair painted brown and about 2 to 3 tones of lighter browns dusted on to have a light cascading effect down the strands of hair. I never really binged and sat down and did many hours per session on this kit. It required many sessions of a small amount of work and a lot of drying time with the putty, the painting and the masking. I got a bit clever to not waste too much masking material by utilising Glad Wrap where there's a large surface that I didn't want overspray to go over. Having the skirt and everything masked down, I was able to go for the blazer, and this one I did take advantage of the pre-shade lines and slowly and carefully wet coat coloured a very dark blue all across and around, and 2 tones further lightened it up to match the colour with the reference I've downloaded off Google. At this stage, with every layer of paint applied where the black lines were initially very ugly, it started becoming a little more pleasing and enjoyable fun to shadow, shade and build up the visual colours of this project. Still, disappointingly, I have sunk way too much hours and time into this very simple quick turnaround project. This is still the experimental and testing process of a new 3D printer, and I'm very hell-bent on having a 1/7 winter scheme Yukari. With a good primed base and the excellent durable nature of lacquer paint, good painting technique and adequate time to dry and chemically harden, once the mask came off, I had an ideal, tight and fairly pleasing finish figure. Now for the step that I dread the most, I used to apply eye decals to all of my Anime Girl GK kits. Got some older ones and I'm not the best at painting eyes. This one was infuriating and difficult as the hair got in the way, but with a very fine brush that I recently purchased and going very circle with the circles and building up of colour off reference, I got something that didn't look cockeyed or cross-eyed, fairly effective enough, and with some small details that I'm sick of masking and airbrushing, hand painted the collar, fine lines and other details to get sort of a Sager-esque finish of a figure. At this stage things are getting a bit tired and blown over, but it's not a terrible model by the Elise state. It would most likely stand with a Sega level figure, just a lot more shading. Far from my best work, but it's something, I suppose. As the different layers of paint are all different shades of satin and gloss, mixing a matte base and a clear matte from Mr. Hobby, thinning it down and dusting it on very lightly, very slowly while pivoting the figure, I managed to matte and dull the sheen to a natural animated cell look. And what would be a winter schemed figure without a winter themed base? I haven't invested a lot in this besides several dollars in resin, including the failed print paint and a lot of automotive paint. I used a food container lid, coated it in PVA glue and air drying clay to build up a mound of natural occurring soil or snow build. Coated the whole thing in the usual blend of filler primer and built up layers of white, grey, black and black around the brim of a snow-based colour, as you would imagine. For the texture, to finish this whole thing off, PVA glue was applied over the painted surface, and with white snow flock, you could also utilise baking soda or talcum powder. I really like the look of this flock though, it's almost crystallized. Sprinkle on top of the wet PVA glue that's been smeared or spread and shake off the excess. This gave a soft powdered heavy snow look for the figure to stand upon and give it a bit of world building or an effect of the universe that the model is standing in, opposed to just a clear neutral base, which would also work. Finally, with my breath held, we've got a finished, printed, painted toy figure of Yukari from Girls and Panzer. A couple of areas is not the neatest in the world, a bit wobbly. I could have done a layer or two of sanding and putty work to finish off, and I could have been far neater in some aspects of painting, masking and not necessarily hand painting. I might have also should have hand painted the eyes a second time. It's mostly just a time factor, and for something that was just a turnaround and experiment with the printer and post-printing experimentation with the XBL file format, I'm fairly happy. It doesn't look totally terrible. But I will come back with a vengeance with another type of these files, change the position around, chop it up in further shapes, and print something that won't have those large blobs of plastic sticking out. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, until next time, stay tuned for further content, and we'll see you later.